You've just executed an entire planetary council. 43 men and women, governors and generals and high priests, their bodies cooling on marble floors that cost more than most citizens will earn in a lifetime. You pulled the trigger yourself, each shot, each life. You watched their eyes as they died, searching for confirmation of guilt or the terrible recognition of innocence. They were innocent, or were they? In the grim darkness of the far future, that question will haunt you until the day you die, and perhaps beyond. This is your life as Gregor Eisenhorn, Inquisitor of the Ordo Xenos, and today you crossed a line you can never uncross. The rosette hanging around your neck weighs nothing, yet it crushes you with the gravity of absolute authority. The bolt pistol in your hand is warm, its machine spirit satisfied with the offering of lives, its barrel still smoking with the cordite perfume of execution. Blood pools around your boots, reflecting the flickering luminators above, and in those crimson mirrors you see the face of someone you used to know, someone who once believed in clear lines between right and wrong. Welcome to the Inquisition. Welcome to damnation disguised as duty. They don't tell you in the propaganda reels how it feels to hold the power of life and death over billions. The imperial citizens see only the mythology, the avenging angel descending from the heavens with authority that supersedes governors and generals, speaking with the emperor's own voice. They whisper your name with reverence and terror in equal measure, never understanding that the terror is justified, that the reverence is misplaced, that you are not their savior but their necessary evil. Your story begins not in glory but in selection, in the cold halls of the Schola Progenium on Terra, where orphans of imperial servants are forged into instruments of the emperor's will. You were 7 years old when the Inquisitor came, his storm coat billowing in recycled air that smelled of incense and fear. He walked through the dormitories like death himself, his eyes scanning faces with the precision of an auger array seeking flaws in adamantium. Most children he passed without acknowledgement. You, he stopped before. You, he studied with an intensity that made your skin crawl and your hearts hammer against your ribs. This one, he said, and those 2 words sealed your fate more completely than any prison sentence or death warrant. The training began immediately, an education in horrors that would break most adult minds. They took you to the deep places beneath the imperial palace, where interrogation chambers echo with centuries of screaming and the walls weep with accumulated anguish. Your mentor, Inquisitor Lord Hapshant of the Ordo Xenos, was a man carved from granite and disappointment, his face a topographical map of scars earned hunting the alien across 100 worlds. He taught you to recognize the 17 distinct neural patterns of Eldar, psychic manipulation. He showed you how to identify genestealer cultists by the almost imperceptible changes in their body language and speech patterns. He forced you to memorize the true names of 37 greater demons, each syllable burning your tongue with corrupt power. Knowledge is power, Hapshant would intone during the long nights of study, his augmetic eye glowing red in the darkness of his personal library. But power corrupts. This is the Inquisitor's paradox. We must know the enemy to fight the enemy, but knowing the enemy means allowing contamination into our souls. We walk the razor's edge between enlightenment and damnation, and most of us eventually fall. You didn't believe him then. Youth grants the dangerous gift of certainty, the conviction that you will be different, stronger, more pure than those who came before. You studied the forbidden texts with the confidence of someone who believed faith was armor-proof against corruption. You learned to identify chaos, iconography, to recognize the subtle signs of demonic possession, to speak the rituals that would banish warp entities back to the hell that spawned them. Each lesson brought you closer to the darkness you were meant to fight, and you never noticed how comfortable that proximity became. Your first mission arrived on your 19th birthday, a gift wrapped in terror and sealed with innocent blood. A frontier world called Maragan's Hope had gone silent, its astropathic communications ending mid-transmission with a scream that echoed through the warp for 3 systems in every direction. You accompanied Hapshant and his retinue aboard the strike cruiser Redeemer's Truth, your heart filled with righteous purpose and your mind stocked with 2 decades of preparation. You thought you were ready. You were wrong. The descent through Muragan's Hope's atmosphere revealed a world transformed into nightmare. Cities burned with fires that cast shadows in impossible directions. The sky roiled, with storms that moved against the wind and screamed with voices you felt in your bones rather than heard with your ears. Your drop pod struck the surface in the capital's central plaza, and you emerged into an abattoir painted in every shade of red that human blood could produce. The Chaos Cult had been thorough in their devotion. Every citizen of the capital, all 3 million souls, had been arranged in ritual patterns that covered 12 square kilometers. The bodies formed vast 8-pointed stars, their positioning so precise it must have taken weeks of careful placement. Children had been used as punctuation marks in a sentence written in flesh, their small forms creating emphasis points in the blasphemous text. The air tasted of copper and corruption, each breath coating your lungs with particles of evil that you would never fully expel. Habshant stood at the edge of the killing field, his storm coat snapping in winds that came from no natural source, his face carved from stone and determination. "This is what we fight," he said, his voice carrying no emotion, no horror, no humanity. "Remember this moment, remember these faces. Let this burn into your memory so deeply that you never forget what mercy costs when extended to the enemy." You vomited then, your enhanced biology rejecting the evidence of absolute evil with the same vigor it would reject poison or disease. Habshant let you finish before speaking again, his hand heavy on your shoulder, more weight than comfort. "Good. That means you're still human. The day you can look at this without feeling anything is the day you should eat your bolt pistol. But don't let that humanity make you weak. These people died because someone, somewhere, showed mercy to a cultist, accepted an excuse from a heretic, believed a lie from a traitor. We are the Inquisition. We do not show mercy. We do not accept excuses. We do not believe lies. We are the Emperor's wrath made manifest, and mercy is a luxury we cannot afford." The hunt for the cult lasted 3 months of brutal warfare through the planet's underhives and wilderness regions. You learned to read the evidence of chaos corruption in graffiti patterns and the arrangement of personal effects in abandoned hab units. You conducted your first interrogation, using techniques that would be called torture by those who had the luxury of not understanding the stakes. The cultists screamed for 17 hours before their mind broke and the intelligence flowed free, and you felt nothing watching them reduce to drooling vacancy because you had seen what their worship had achieved. Your first kill was a cult leader, a former planetary governor who had sold his world to the ruinous powers in exchange for promises of eternal life and limitless pleasure. You found him in a chapel dedicated to Slanesh, his body transformed by his patron's gifts into something that hurt to perceive. Beauty and horror merged so completely they became indistinguishable. He spoke to you in a voice like music and breaking glass, offering you everything you had ever wanted if you would simply lower your bolt pistol and listen to reason. You shot him in the face. The bolt round entered through his left eye and detonated inside his skull, spreading his transcendent thoughts across Baroque murals depicting acts that had no names in any human language. His body collapsed like a puppet with cut strings, the mutations fading as the warp energy sustaining them dissipated back into the Imperium. You felt nothing, no triumph, no disgust, no satisfaction, just the mechanical completion of a necessary task. Habshant smiled then, an expression that looked wrong on his scarred face, like watching a statue learn to move. "You'll do," he said, and those 2 words felt heavier than any commendation or honor you would ever receive. 20 years passed in blood and investigation, each mission adding another layer of scar tissue to your body and your soul. You learned the Inquisitor's craft through application rather than theory, discovering that real field work bore little resemblance to the sterile lessons conducted in Terra's deep vaults. The galaxy was messier than doctrine suggested, more complicated than protocol accommodated, and far more cruel than even the grimmest propaganda admitted. Habshant died on a world whose name you've deliberately forgotten, torn apart by a daemon prince while you watched from behind psychic wards he had erected with his last strength. His final act was protecting you, giving you the time to complete the banishment ritual while the demon fed on his soul. His screaming echoed through your nightmares for years afterward, A reminder that even the strongest fall, that even the most prepared can be caught, that death is the only certainty in a universe of variables. The inquisitorial conclave elevated you 3 months later, the ceremony brief and perfunctory, because they needed bodies in the field more than they needed pageantry. They placed the rosette in your hands, its weight simultaneously nothing and everything, and told you that you now spoke with the Emperor's voice across a dozen systems. The power was absolute. The responsibility was crushing. The isolation was immediate. You assembled your retinue with the care of a master craftsman selecting tools for a masterwork. Each member chosen not just for their skills, but for their willingness to walk the paths that others feared to tread, their ability to witness horrors without breaking, their talent for necessary evils performed with professional precision. Godwin Fishig became your first and most trusted agent, a former enforcer from the hive world of Gudrun whose faith was as simple as it was absolute. The man believed in law the way others believed in gods, his dedication to order making him invaluable in investigations that sprawled across Byzantine bureaucracies and corrupt power structures. He could read a data manifest and identify the subtle anomalies that indicated heretical activity, spot the patterns in shipping records that suggested cult networks, trace financial transactions through layers of obfuscation that would baffle even administratum savants. His weakness was the same as his strength. Absolute faith meant absolute inflexibility, and you knew that one day his inability to compromise would force you to choose between your mission and your friend. Elizabeth Bequin entered your service as an enigma wrapped in paradox, a blank whose anti-psychic properties made her invisible to warp senses and immune to demonic possession. In a universe where psychic powers were both weapon and threat, Bequin was negative space, an absence that moved through crowds like a hole in reality. She could walk through warp storms unscathed, stand beside daemons without corruption, pass through psychic wards as if they didn't exist. Her presence gave you headaches, a pressure behind your eyes that never fully faded, but her value far exceeded the discomfort. You told yourself that was why you kept her close, ignoring the way her company filled spaces in your life that duty had hollowed out. Harlon Nail signed on as muscle and tactical expertise, a bounty hunter whose considerable skills were matched only by his complete lack of moral complexity. Nail killed for money with the same professional efficiency most people applied to filing reports, his conscience apparently edited out during some childhood trauma he refused to discuss. He was loyal so long as you paid him, honest in his dishonesty, and reliable in his absolute pragmatism. You trusted him more than colleagues who swore oaths to the Emperor because Nail's motivations were simple and his word, once given for adequate compensation, was adamantium. Your interrogator, Gideon Ravener, joined as a young psyker of exceptional talent and dangerous potential. Every sanctioned psyker walked the knife's edge between controlled power and catastrophic possession, but Ravener's abilities marked him as either future asset or future threat, depending on factors too numerous to predict. You took him on anyway, recognizing in his eyes the same hunger for justice that had driven you into Hapshunt's service decades before. You would train him as you had been trained, hoping to forge him into something useful before the galaxy broke him into something dangerous. This was your team, your found family, the people you would trust with your life while never fully trusting them with your secrets. Together you hunted the darkness across the Gothic sector and beyond, following threads of corruption through layers of imperial society that most citizens never knew existed. The investigation that changed everything began with a corpse in a snowdrift on Hubris, a mining world where the only things more abundant than promethium were reasons to leave. The body belonged to a mid-level administratum clerk named Iron Max, his throat cut with professional precision and his augmetic data ports torn out with considerably less skill. Local enforcers classified it as a robbery gone wrong, filed the appropriate reports in triplicate, and moved on to the 17 other murders that had occurred that week in the capital hive alone. But you noticed what they missed. The cuts on Max's hands were defensive wounds, yes, but the pattern suggested he had been fighting someone trained in the Calidus Temple assassination techniques. The missing data ports had been removed post-mortem by someone searching for specific information rather than valuable augmetics to fence. Most tellingly, The body had been arranged in a position that would have been uncomfortable for a corpse in rigor mortis unless someone had deliberately posed it, and the angle of the limbs formed a pattern you recognized from forbidden texts as a marker used by a long-extinct chaos cult. Extinct. The word echoed in your mind with the weight of questions, unanswered and assumptions challenged. You pulled the files on 17 similar murders across 4 subsectors, each victim an administratum worker with access to shipping manifests and cargo records, each death staged to look like random violence, while displaying subtle signs of ritual significance. The pattern emerged like a constellation forming from scattered stars, beautiful and terrible in its implications. Someone was systematically eliminating everyone with knowledge of specific cargo shipments, and they were using chaos cult methodology to mark their work. Either the cult wasn't as extinct as Imperial records claimed, or someone wanted you to think they were dealing with chaos when the truth was something else entirely. Both possibilities were equally troubling. Fischig dove into the Administratum archives with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely enjoyed reading shipping manifests, his trained eye scanning thousands of documents, searching for the pattern that connected the victims. 3 weeks of exhaustive research produced a result that made your blood freeze in your veins. Every murdered clerk had processed paperwork for the same merchant vessel, a bulk freighter called the Marvelous Prospect that ran routes between Hubris and a dozen frontier worlds. The ship's registered owner was a holding company that existed only on paper, its board of directors consisting of names borrowed from famous imperial saints dead for millennia. The ship itself had changed registry 4 times in the last decade, each time after its previous identity had been linked to smuggling charges that somehow never resulted in prosecution. Its current captain, one Silas Grail, had a service record so exemplary it was almost certainly fabricated, filled with commendations from officers who had died in the same void battles they supposedly survived together. You requisitioned passage on the next outbound transport to the Marvelous Prospect's last known port of call, a frontier station called Fersen's Rest, that orbited a gas giant at the edge of the subsector. The station was a ramshackle collection of docking spars and habitation modules held together by prayers to the omnia and the inertia of centuries, home to 40,000 souls who made their living servicing ships that traveled routes too unprofitable for major chartist captains to bother with. Fersen's Rest smelled of recycled air and recycled hope, its corridors crowded with laborers and drifters and people running from pasts they'd rather forget. You moved through the masses like a shark through shallow water, your inquisitorial authority clearing paths through crowds that would have crushed lesser men. Bequin followed in your wake, her blank presence making people unconsciously step aside without understanding why. Nail brought up the rear, his hand never far from the plasma pistol holstered at his hip, his eyes scanning for threats with the perpetual paranoia of someone who had survived too long in dangerous places. The harbormaster's office occupied a corner of the station's primary docking control, its walls covered in shipping schedules and purity seals in equal measure. The harbormaster himself was a wizened servo skull of a man named Porteous Thew, his body more augmetic than flesh after 6 decades of working in low-gravity environments. He took one look at your rosette and began sweating despite his coolant system's best efforts. "I need the manifests for the Marvelous Prospect," you said without preamble. "Every cargo shipment for the last 5 years. And I need the names of everyone who had access to those records." Porteous's remaining organic eye twitched with the distinctive rhythm of someone whose augmetic systems were fighting a losing battle against rising blood pressure. His mechadendrites clattered against the desk like nervous fingers drumming metal. "That information is protected by Merchant Guild privileges and privacy regulations," he wheezed, the words emerging with all the conviction of a man reciting liturgy he didn't believe. "I would need proper authorization forms filed in triplicate with." You placed your bolt pistol on his desk with a thud that made coffee cups jump. The weapon sat between you like a promise and a threat, its machine spirit humming with barely contained eagerness. "This is my authorization," you said softly, letting the words carry the weight of absolute authority. "You have 60 seconds to provide the information. After that, I'll assume you're obstructing an inquisitorial investigation and act accordingly." The manifests appeared on your data slate in 45 seconds. The cargo records revealed a pattern of legitimate shipments punctuated by suspicious anomalies. Most loads were standard frontier goods, mining equipment and processed ore, and the endless stream of supplies required to keep humanity functioning on the edge of civilized space. But buried among the routine shipments were containers marked as agricultural supplies whose weight ratios didn't match their declared contents. Machinery shipments bound for agri-worlds that had no industrial infrastructure to support such equipment, and medical supplies, in quantities that would outfit a military field hospital heading to worlds with no recorded medical facilities. Someone was smuggling something, using the marvelous prospect as a mobile warehouse that moved contraband through a network of frontier worlds, where imperial oversight was minimal and local authorities were easily bribed or intimidated. The question was what they were smuggling and why they were willing to kill to protect that secret. You found Captain Grail in a dockside bar called the Void's End, an establishment whose name was either optimistic or prophetic depending on how much you drank. He sat alone in a corner booth, nursing amasec that probably cost more than most patrons earned in a week, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd with the wariness of prey animal in predator territory. He was younger than you expected, perhaps 40 standard years, with the kind of handsome features that inspired trust right up until you noticed the coldness in his eyes. You slid into the booth across from him without invitation, Bequin taking position at the bar where she could watch the exits, Nail materializing at a nearby table with sightlines covering the entire room. Grail's hand moved toward his coat pocket, stopped when he saw your rosette gleaming in the dim luminator light. "Captain Grail," you began, your voice pitched low enough that nearby patrons couldn't hear over the bar's ambient noise. "We need to discuss your cargo manifests, and the people who've been dying to protect your secrets." His face remained perfectly calm, but you had conducted enough interrogations to read the micro-expressions that betrayed inner turmoil. The slight dilation of pupils indicating adrenaline surge, the almost imperceptible tension in jaw muscles suggesting clenched teeth. The way his breathing shifted from relaxed to controlled, consciously maintaining rhythm to avoid appearing panicked. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, the words delivered with practiced sincerity. "I run a legitimate freight operation. My manifests are completely in order." "If someone has made accusations, 17 people are dead," you interrupted, letting each word fall like a hammer blow. 17 administratum clerks who processed your paperwork, all killed with professional efficiency, all posed in patterns that suggest ritual significance. So you can maintain your innocence if it makes you feel better, but we both know you're going to tell me everything. The only variable is how much pain you experience first. Grail's composure cracked like overstressed ceramite. His hand dove into his coat pocket, emerging with a compact las pistol that tracked toward your face with the speed of genuine panic. You were faster, your bolt pistol already drawn beneath the table, its barrel pressed against his knee hard enough that he could feel the muzzle through fabric and flesh. "Don't," you said simply. You fire that weapon, and Nail puts a plasma round through your spine before your corpse hits the floor. "I'm offering you a chance to cooperate. Take it." The weapon trembled in his hand for 3 heartbeats before clattering to the table. You motioned for Nail to secure it, never taking your eyes off Grail's face, watching as defiance transformed into calculation and finally settled on resigned cooperation. "They'll kill me," he whispered, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man recognizing his own doom. "If I talk, if I give you names, they'll know. They have people everywhere. They'll find me no matter where I run." "Then your best option is inquisitorial protection," you replied, the lie coming easily because it was what he needed to hear. "Tell me who they are. Tell me what you've been smuggling. Tell me everything, and I'll make sure you live long enough to regret your choices." Grail stared at his hands, watching them shake with the tremors of adrenaline crash and existential terror. When he finally spoke, his words spilled out with the desperate speed of confession extracted at gunpoint. "Saruthi artifacts," he said. "Xenos technology from dead worlds at the sector's edge. They hired me to transport them, promised more money than I'd see in 10 lifetimes of legitimate work. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know. I just moved the containers from pickup points to delivery coordinates and collected my payment. Your blood turned to ice in your veins. The Saruthi were a Xenos species whose mastery of warp technology had destroyed them millennia ago, leaving behind artifacts of terrible power and alien design scattered across dead worlds that Imperial cartographers marked with warning sigils and dire prophecies. Possessing Saruthi technology was heresy of the highest order, punishable by execution after extensive interrogation to ensure the contamination hadn't spread. Who hired you? The question emerged with deadly calm. I need names. I need locations. I need everything you know about the organization behind this. Grail's eyes darted around the bar as if expecting assassins to materialize from the shadows. I never met them directly. All communication went through intermediaries, dead drops, and encrypted Vox channels. But I heard names. Whispers. There's someone called the Pontius, some kind of leader or organizer, and they're working from somewhere in the Drunner subsector, coordinating shipments across 24 worlds. Before you could ask another question, the luminator lights died. The bar plunged into darkness, broken only by emergency lighting that cast everything in sickly red. You heard movement, the distinctive sound of trained operators moving through crowds with practiced efficiency. Your enhanced senses picked up the scent of ozone that suggested energy weapons preparing to discharge. Ambush, the word crystallized in your mind with absolute certainty. They had been watching Grail, waiting to see if he would break, ready to eliminate both the liability and the Inquisitor investigating him. They had chosen their moment well, catching you in an environment where collateral damage would be extensive and escape routes were limited. You dove beneath the table as las fire scorched the air where your head had been milliseconds before. Grail's chest exploded in a spray of superheated blood as a las round designed for armored targets punched through his sternum and detonated his internal organs. His mouth opened to scream, but only bloody foam emerged before he collapsed forward onto the table, dead before his brain could process the damage. Nail's plasma pistol lit the darkness with blue-white fury, his shot vaporizing an assassin who had been moving through the panicked crowd toward your position. Bequin was already in motion, her blank presence disrupting whatever psychic coordination the attackers might have been using, her compact autopistol spitting rounds with mechanical precision. You rolled out from under the table, bolt pistol tracking toward muzzle flashes. Each round you fired a statement of absolute authority in a situation spiraling toward chaos. The firefight lasted 90 seconds that felt like hours, a close-quarters battle in cramped space where every shot risked hitting civilians, and every moment of hesitation invited death. You moved through the killing ground with the muscle memory of decades, your body executing techniques drilled into you during training while your mind catalogued details for later analysis. The attackers were professionals, their movements coordinated despite lacking Vox communication, their targeting priorities suggesting military training or better. When the last assassin fell, the bar resembled an abattoir painted in Lasburn scoring and bolt-round devastation. 14 civilians lay dead, or dying, caught in crossfire they couldn't comprehend and didn't deserve. 23 more bore injuries ranging from minor to crippling. The Void's End had lived up to its name for far too many people whose only crime was wanting a drink in the wrong place at the wrong time. You stood in the center of the carnage, your bolt pistol still warm, your coat spattered with blood that belonged to people whose names you'd never learn. Grail's corpse stared at you with accusing eyes, mouth frozen in a scream that never emerged, his last expression a perfect encapsulation of terror and betrayal. He had trusted you to protect him. He had believed your lie about inquisitorial protection. His death was on your hands as surely as if you'd pulled the trigger yourself. This is what it means to be an Inquisitor. Standing in rooms full of bodies and searching them for intelligence while ignoring the humanity that had inhabited them. Making promises you know you can't keep to extract information from. People who are already dead and just don't know it yet. Watching innocents die because your investigation drew killers to their location and accepting that their deaths are simply the cost of doing business in the Emperor's name. The assassins carried no identification. Their weapons were unmarked, and their bodies bore no distinguishing features beyond professional scars and military-grade augmetics. But one of them had a data slate in a coat pocket, its screen cracked from impact but still functional. You scrolled through encrypted files, recognizing the cipher patterns as variations on codes used by certain Mechanicus factions for internal communications. The trail had led you from murdered clerks to Xenos artifacts to assassins with Mechanicus connections. Someone with significant resources and technical expertise was smuggling Saruthi technology through frontier worlds, killing anyone who might expose the operation, and now they knew an Inquisitor was investigating. They would go to ground, burn their networks, eliminate loose ends with the same efficiency they had demonstrated in the Void's End. You had to move faster. You had to push harder. You had to make the kind of choices that doctrine warned against and necessity demanded. The investigation consumed the next 3 months, a frantic chase across half a dozen worlds following leads that evaporated like morning frost and contacts who died before they could share what they knew. The conspiracy proved deeper and wider than you had imagined, its roots spreading through every level of imperial society from dockworkers to planetary governors. Everyone had been bought or intimidated into silence, their cooperation ensured through threats that were clearly not idle given the body count mounting in your wake. You found yourself making compromises that would have horrified the Puritan you had been when you first received your rosette. Authorizing Bequin to use her blank abilities to disable psychic wards, protecting heretical archives so you could steal forbidden texts, allowing Nail to torture informants when time was too short for conventional interrogation methods, turning a blind eye when Ravener used his psychic powers to rip information directly from suspects' minds, leaving them drooling vegetables incapable of standing trial. Each compromise came with justification. The information saved lives, the torture prevented greater suffering, the psychic violation was more merciful than the alternatives. You told yourself these things in the quiet moments between crises, building a framework of rationalization that would support the weight of actions you couldn't take back. The trail led eventually to Drunna Secundus, an industrial world where factorums belched toxic smoke into atmosphere that had long ago surrendered any pretense of breathability. The planetary governor, Lord Brem Oberon, had been a distinguished Imperial Guard general before retiring to oversee industrial, production quotas, and labor disputes. His record was exemplary, his loyalty unquestioned, his service to the Emperor spanning 6 decades without blemish or controversy. Your investigation revealed him as the conspiracy's architect, the mastermind coordinating Saruthi artifact smuggling across 2 subsectors. He had used his military connections to recruit operatives, his governmental authority to shield operations from scrutiny, and his reputation to deflect any suspicion that might have fallen his way. He was brilliant, careful, and absolutely guilty of heresy that demanded execution after extensive interrogation. But proof was not the same as evidence admissible in official proceedings. Your investigation had been built on methods that would never survive. Inquisitorial review, using sources that couldn't testify without implicating themselves, following trails of logic that required accepting premises based on intuition rather than documentation. You knew Oberon was guilty. You couldn't prove it in any court that mattered. The entire planetary government was complicit, their cooperation either bought through Oberon's largesse or ensured through his military connections. The PDF answered to him personally, their officers selected for loyalty rather than competence. The Arbite's garrison commander was his former aide-de-camp from Guard service. The Administratum overseer had been receiving bribes for 15 years. The Mechanicus representative was actively involved in studying the Saruthi artifacts, their heretical research funded through diverted industrial revenues. 43 people sat on various councils and committees that formed the planet's governmental structure. All of them knew about the smuggling operation or had deliberately avoided asking questions that would force them to know. All of them had benefited from the enormous profits generated by selling Xenos technology to collectors, cults, and other parties whose interest in such items was by definition heretical. Standard procedure demanded you forward your findings to the sector. Inquisitorial conclave, petition for additional resources, build an airtight case through patient accumulation of documentation and testimony. That process would take years, during which time Oberon would have opportunity to destroy evidence, eliminate witnesses, and potentially escape justice by fleeing into the void aboard one of the many ships his position gave him access to. Or you could handle it yourself, immediately, permanently. You sat in your quarters aboard your commandeered transport. The evidence spread before you like accusation and invitation. Bequin, perched on the arm of your chair, her presence a headache that had become comforting through familiarity, her hand resting on your shoulder with gentle weight. Nail cleaned his plasma pistol with the methodical focus of a man who understood that weapons maintenance was spiritual practice for those whose only faith was in firepower. Ravener meditated in the corner, his psychic senses extended to ensure no one was spying on your deliberations. "We could take them," Nail said without looking up from his work. 43 targets, across a dozen locations. Difficult, but not impossible. I'd need 2 weeks to plan it properly, acquire local resources, establish extraction protocols. It would be murder. Fischig's voice emerged from the Vox unit, the investigator having remained aboard your ship in orbit. Execution without trial. Violation of every principle the Inquisition claims to uphold. The Imperium has laws for reasons. We cannot become the very chaos we fight. They're guilty. Ravener spoke without opening his eyes, his psychic senses having already plundered Oberon's surface thoughts during a carefully arranged encounter. I've touched his mind. The corruption runs deeper than heresy. He's been in contact with something in the warp, something that whispers promises of power and transformation. If we delay, if we follow proper protocols, the taint will spread beyond our ability to contain. You stared at the evidence, watching it blur as exhaustion pulled at your consciousness. When had you last slept? Properly slept, without nightmares of burning worlds and screaming children, and all the faces of everyone who had died because you weren't fast enough, smart enough, ruthless enough? The decision crystallized with the inevitability of gravity asserting itself on falling objects. You would eliminate the entire planetary government. You would do it personally, without authorization or oversight, using methods that would horrify your colleagues and satisfy your own sense of justice. You would become judge, jury, and executioner, because the alternative was allowing heresy to flourish while you filed reports in triplicate and waited for approval that might never come. Bequin squeezed your shoulder, understanding your choice without requiring explanation. Nail nodded and began plotting assassination. Protocols, with the enthusiasm of an artist finally given permission to create his masterwork. Ravener's expression flickered with something that might have been approval, or might have been recognition that his master had just damned himself beyond redemption. Only Fischig's voice carried dissent through the Vox, his words heavy with disappointment and growing suspicion. If you do this, you're no better than they are. You're using your authority to bypass law, to become the tyranny the Inquisition exists to prevent. I'm begging you to reconsider. I'm begging you not to cross this line. The line was crossed the moment I accepted this rosette, you replied, and terminated the connection before he could argue further. The operation unfolded with mechanical precision across a single night of coordination and violence. You moved through Oberon's gubernatorial palace, like death given purpose, your bolt pistol speaking the Emperor's judgment to targets who never understood what was happening until it was too late. Some died without comprehension, cut down before they could process why an Inquisitor had broken into their chambers. Others had time to beg, to plead innocence or ignorance, to offer bribes or threaten connections that might have protected them if you had been interested in anything other than ending threats. 43 bodies, 43 lives terminated in the space of 6 hours. Men and women shot in their beds, or at their desks, or fleeing down corridors that offered no escape. You watched the life drain from their eyes, searching each face for confirmation of guilt or recognition of innocence, finding both and neither because morality had become too complex for simple categories. Lord Oberon died last, alone in his study, surrounded by campaign maps and commendations earned through decades of faithful service. He looked up from his desk as you entered, his face cycling through surprise, recognition, and finally resignation. I suppose this was inevitable, he said calmly, as if discussing whether rather than his imminent execution. The Inquisition always finds out eventually. May I know why you chose extrajudicial killing over proper trial? Because a trial would have taken years and cost more lives, you replied, your bolt pistol steady in your hand. Because every day you remained free was another day the corruption spread. Because I have the authority to make this choice and the certainty that I'm right. And that certainty doesn't trouble you? Oberon leaned back in his chair with the dignity of a man who had faced death on dozens of battlefields and understood that this time there would be no dramatic last stand. The certainty that allows one man to decide the fate of 43 others without oversight or appeal. That's not justice. That's tyranny wearing an inquisitorial seal. Perhaps, you acknowledged, but tyranny that protects the Imperium is preferable to justice that allows it to burn. You pulled the trigger. Before he could respond, the bolt round entering through his forehead and detonating inside his skull, spreading his philosophical objections across antique furniture and priceless artwork. His body slumped forward onto the desk, blood pooling around campaign maps that would now never be used, commendations that had been earned in service to an emperor whose representative had just executed him without trial. Standing in that study, surrounded by the evidence of a life of service that had ended in heresy and death, you felt something inside you crack. Not break, not shatter, but develop stress fractures that would spread and multiply with each subsequent compromise. The man you had been, the Puritan who believed in clear lines between right and wrong, died in that moment as surely as Oberon had died. What remained was something harder, more pragmatic, and infinitely more dangerous. The aftermath was managed through careful application of authority and selective truth. Official reports described a chaos cult that had infiltrated planetary government, requiring immediate sanction to prevent warp contamination. The PDF accepted your story because questioning an inquisitor's judgment was more dangerous than accepting obvious lies. The sector conclave reviewed your actions and found them within acceptable parameters because the alternative was admitting that one of their own had gone rogue, and dealing with that possibility was more trouble than it was worth. But Fischig knew the truth. He had listened to your Vox communications, witnessed your planning sessions, understood that you had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. He said nothing during the official debriefings, his face a mask of professional neutrality, but his eyes carried accusation and disappointment and the growing recognition that his master was becoming the very thing they hunted. The investigation into Saruthi artifacts continued, each revelation pulling you deeper into a conspiracy that spanned sectors and centuries. The artifacts themselves were weapons of terrible sophistication, technology that operated on principles imperial science couldn't explain and shouldn't attempt to understand. Some opened doorways into the warp, allowing travel without navigators or Gellerfields. Others manipulated perception, making people see and believe things that contradicted physical evidence and personal memory. A few appeared to alter reality itself, changing fundamental constants in localized areas with effects that ranged from miraculous to catastrophic. Understanding them required studying them. Studying them meant exposure to principles that existed at the intersection of materiality and immateriality, science and sorcery, reason and madness. Each hour spent analyzing Saruthi technology brought new insights and new contamination, knowledge bleeding into your consciousness whether you wanted it or not. You established a private archive in your ship's most secure vault, filling it with artifacts and texts that would justify immediate execution if discovered by Puritan colleagues. The collection grew with each investigation, every case adding new pieces to a library of forbidden knowledge that you told yourself you were gathering for research purposes, while ignoring how comfortable you had become, working with tools of heresy. The first daemon host entered your service 3 years after Oberon's death, birthed from necessity, when you faced a chaos cult led by a possessed sorcerer whose powers exceeded your team's ability to counter conventionally. Ravenna suggested it during a planning session, his voice carefully neutral, as he explained the procedure for binding a daemon into a human host and compelling its service. The technique was unquestionably heretical, explicitly forbidden by inquisitorial doctrine, and would work where conventional methods would fail. You authorized it. The ritual was conducted in secret, using a volunteer whose faith made. them willing to become a vessel for abomination if it served the Emperor's purposes. The daemon screamed as Ravenor's psychic chains bound it into flesh too frail to contain its essence, the host's body warping under the strain of housing something never meant to exist in real space. When the binding was complete, you possessed a weapon of devastating power and equally devastating corruption, a tool that made you complicit in the very evil you claimed to fight. The daemon host proved invaluable in the battle against the cult, its supernatural abilities countering the sorcerer's warp-spawned powers, its very existence disrupting the chaos forces enough that your team could achieve victory. But the cost was measured in more than lives. Fishig witnessed the binding, watched you command demonic entities, with the same authority you claimed came from the Emperor, and something in him broke. His faith had been absolute. His loyalty had been unwavering. Your corruption of both destroyed the foundation of his identity. He left your service 3 weeks later, his resignation delivered with the formality of a funeral rite. "I cannot serve an Inquisitor who has become what we hunt," he said, his voice carrying neither anger nor disappointment, only exhausted sadness. "You've bound daemons, you've studied heretical texts, you've made compromises that have no end point, no place where you'll finally say that you've gone too far. I pray for your soul, but I will not be party to its damnation. You let him go because the alternative was acknowledging that he was right, that you had crossed into territory where redemption was no longer possible, where the question wasn't whether you had fallen but how far. His departure hurt more than you expected, a loss that felt like amputation of something essential. But you told yourself it was necessary, that he lacked the moral flexibility required for field work, that his Puritan rigidity would have eventually gotten people killed. The justifications came easier now. The lies you told yourself required less effort to believe. Your reputation evolved from Puritan crusader to radical operator, your name spoken with increasing concern in inquisitorial conclaves, where colleagues debated whether you were a valuable asset or a threat that needed elimination. Some defended you, pointing to your success rate and the sectors saved through your intervention. Others called for your excommunication, arguing that methods indistinguishable from heresy could not produce righteous results regardless of stated intentions. You operated in the spaces between, neither fully sanctioned nor completely condemned, your authority intact but under constant scrutiny. Every mission might be your last, every decision potentially the one that finally prompted the conclave to declare you extremis diabolus and dispatch other inquisitors to end the threat you had become. The loneliness was absolute. Bequin remained loyal, her blank nature making her immune to the corruption that justified others' abandonment. Nail stayed because you paid well, and your missions provided opportunities for violence that satisfied whatever darkness drove him. Ravener followed your example, perhaps too well, his own descent into radicalism accelerating as he watched his master embrace methods he had been taught to despise. But real connection, honest companionship, relationships built on trust rather than necessity or transaction, these became impossible. Everyone who got close either left in disgust like Fishig, or died in service like too many others whose names filled the list you kept in your personal effects, a memorial to people who had trusted you and paid for that trust with their lives. You found yourself sitting alone in your quarters during transit between investigations, surrounded by artifacts that whispered promises in languages you shouldn't understand and texts that revealed truths you shouldn't know. Your reflection in the Palai mirror showed a face weathered by decades of stress, marked by scars from assassination attempts, aged beyond your years by decisions that would haunt anyone with functioning conscience. The question haunted you in moments of unwanted introspection: had you become what you hunted? You bound daemons like chaos sorcerers. You studied forbidden lore like heretic scholars. You operated outside law and oversight like the very threats you claimed to oppose. The only difference was stated intention, the claim that you served the Emperor while they served themselves or darker powers. But how much of that difference was real, and how much was rationalization, self-deception dressed up as moral clarity? Henry Cavill might play you in some future drama, his heroic features and commanding presence perfect for portraying the Inquisitor as noble guardian of humanity. But the reality was messier than any portrayal could capture, more complicated than narrative allowed, darker than audiences wanted to see. You weren't a hero. You were someone doing terrible things for potentially good reasons, while growing increasingly uncertain about whether the reasons justified the actions or you had simply become very good at lying to yourself. The final crisis arrived without warning, as such things always do. A routine investigation into cult activity on a frontier world revealed connections to the Saruthi artifact network you had been tracking for years. The conspiracy had reformed, Hydra-like, after your purge of Oberon's organization. New players had filled the vacuum, their operation more sophisticated and their security tighter. The trail led to an organization called the Pontius, the same name Grail had mentioned before dying in the Void's End all those years ago. The Pontius was not a person but a collective, a group of powerful individuals from across Imperial society who had united around shared interest in Xenos technology and willingness to commit heresy in pursuit of knowledge. They included Mechanicus Magi, hungry for technological secrets, rogue traders seeking competitive advantages, planetary governors wanting weapons beyond Imperial restrictions, and inquisitors who had fallen farther than you and justified it with philosophy instead of practical necessity. Facing them would require everything you had become, every compromise you had made, every forbidden technique you had learned. It would mean fully embracing the corruption you had spent years pretending was controlled and limited. It would mean becoming, completely and irrevocably, the thing you had sworn to destroy. Or you could stop, walk away, petition the conclave for support and wait while they deliberated, and the conspiracy continued spreading its infection through the Imperium's body. Follow proper protocols and accept that the righteous path might mean accepting preventable harm while you dotted procedural I's and crossed bureaucratic T's, standing in your quarters with the weight of decades pressing down on you. You realized that was never really an option. You had come too far, sacrificed too much, become too corrupted to turn back now. The path you had chosen led only forward, into darker territories and more terrible compromises, until eventually you would either achieve victory or become indistinguishable from the enemy. You activated your Vox unit and summoned your retinue. Bequin arrived first, her presence a headache that felt like coming home. Nail followed with weapons already checked and loaded. Ravener floated in on his suspensor chair, his ruined body a reminder of sacrifices made in service to your increasingly questionable crusade. "We're going after the Pontius," you announced. "All of them. Every member, every operation, every artifact they've gathered. We're going to burn the entire conspiracy down, and we're going to use every tool at our disposal, no matter how heretical. This is going to damn us, all of us, but it's going to save billions. So I'm calling it righteous and living with the consequences." Bequin smiled, finding humor in your willingness to own your corruption. Niall grinned, eager for the violence such an operation would require. Ravener's expression was unreadable, but his psychic presence radiated approval, or perhaps recognition, that you had finally accepted what he had known for years. You had become the monster that hunts monsters. You had crossed every line you swore to hold. You had justified corruption with necessity and heresy with results until the difference between Inquisitor and threat had become semantic rather than meaningful. But somewhere in the Gothic sector, an organization trafficked in technologies that could destroy worlds and corrupt populations. Somewhere in the darkness, people plotted against the Imperium, using tools that should never have been discovered. Somewhere in the void between stars, heresy flourished because good people followed proper protocols while bad people did whatever worked. You would stop them, not because you were good or righteous or pure, but because someone had to stand in the darkness, and you had already damned yourself so thoroughly that a little more corruption wouldn't make a difference. You would use their tools against them, fight their heresy with your own, become the evil that opposed greater evil and call it duty, because calling it anything else would require admitting truths too terrible to speak aloud. This is what it means to be an Eisenhorn Inquisitor in the grim darkness of the far future. walking the line between savior and monster until you can no longer tell which side you stand on, making impossible choices and living with consequences that would crush anyone with functioning conscience, damning yourself piece by piece until you look in the mirror and see a stranger, then picking up your bolt pistol and going back to work because someone has to do the terrible things and you've already made yourself perfect for the role. You clean your weapons in the silence between missions, the ritual soothing in its mechanical simplicity. The rosette sits on your desk, gleaming in candlelight, symbol of authority unlimited and burden unbearable. Tomorrow you'll make more impossible choices, save more lives, take more lives, and add more weight to a conscience that should have broken years ago. The question that haunts you in quiet moments is not whether you've become what you hunt. That answer is obvious to anyone paying attention. The question is whether the transformation was worth it, whether the lives saved justified the souls spent, whether protection purchased with damnation is actually protection or just slow-motion destruction wearing a different mask. You don't have an answer. You stopped looking for one years ago, when you realized that certainty was a luxury reserved for people who hadn't seen what you've seen, done what you've done, become what you've become. The galaxy needs monsters to fight monsters. You've made yourself into the perfect weapon, honed yourself into something that can operate in darkness without flinching, use tools of corruption without being consumed. At least that's what you tell yourself. At least that's the justification that lets you sleep at night, when sleep comes at all. Somewhere in the void, the Pontius continues its work. Somewhere in your ship, artifacts whisper promises in languages that bypass conscious thought. Somewhere in your soul, the last fragments of the Puritan you used to be scream warnings you've learned to ignore. You'll hunt them tomorrow. You'll use every heretical technique and forbidden tool you've gathered. You'll cross lines that even radicals call extreme. And when it's done, when the conspiracy is burned and the artifacts destroyed and the heretics executed, you'll add another entry to the list of justifications you use to convince yourself that you're still serving the Emperor rather than just serving your own conception of necessity. This is your existence. This is your burden. This is the price of power exercised without oversight and authority wielded without restraint. You are judge, jury, and executioner, operating in shadows where even other inquisitors fear to tread, becoming the darkness so others can pretend to live in light. And if that makes you damned, well, damnation is just another tool in the arsenal of someone doing the Emperor's work in ways the Emperor would never officially condone. The rosette gleams. The weapons wait. Tomorrow's horrors approach with the inevitability of orbital mechanics. You'll face them as you faced everything else, with grim determination and moral flexibility and the terrible certainty that someone has to do this work even if doing it destroys them. That someone is you. That someone has always been you. That someone will continue to be you until finally the weight crushes you completely, or the corruption consumes you fully, or a colleague decides you've become too dangerous to tolerate. Until then, you have work to do, heretics to hunt, conspiracies to burn, lines to cross, justifications to construct. The Emperor's work, performed by someone the Emperor would likely execute on sight if he knew the methods employed in his name. Welcome to the Inquisition. Welcome to necessary evil. Welcome to the rest of your life, however long that lasts before damnation claims its due.